Well, it's time to reconvene with another conversation, which I think will be slightly different, with different perspectives. I think I'm looking forward to this because every person on this panel is somebody that has a really deep understanding of Olin, a deep understanding of engineering and engineering education globally, and a perspective on what Olin means globally and what Olin could be looking forward. So first I want to introduce our moderator, who really needs no introduction within Olin. It's Manno, our Provost since 2011 until just very recently. He's on sabbatical now. We reminded him that he's still an employee of the college, so we can recall him to do stuff like this. He's a fantastic partner and engineer. Actually, he's a nuclear engineer, I believe, and so that explains why he has this sort of radioactive personality that people are attracted to. So thank you, Vin, for coming back to do this. We also have Lynn Stein, who needs no introduction within the college. It's one of the founding faculty members at Olin. She is the person who, more than anyone else, is responsible for launching what we now call the Collaboratory in Olin's engagement with the rest of the world outside of the Oval, which is really terrific. We have Bunshaft, who is from Dassault Systèmes, a French company that is a global leader in software development and engineering. And I keep running into Al on different continents. We were just talking about that. This is the third time I've met Al since August, and the first time in the US. So we met in South America, and then we met in the UK, and now we're meeting here. We're often together on panels. For a corporate leader, Al has had more impact on engineering education than almost anyone I know. He chaired the task force of the group of STEM Connector, which I believe is 6,000 corporations, looking at the workforce of the future, talking about what do we know about how graduates perform after they leave, what needs to be changed in terms of going forward, and he has very important insights in that problem. And of course we have Ruth Graham, who really deserves some kind of a special medal for today. She flew in from the UK last night, and she's flying back to the UK this evening. May not be able to stay for the rest of our session this afternoon. Ruth, of course, is an international consultant. She's in high demand. Europe uses her all the time, particularly in the RAE, but also MIT has used a lot of her time. She is the author of the MIT report on the global state of the art of engineering education, which is one of our favorite books here at Olin. And she's also a consultant who has enormous insight into how education works in the classroom. I think this is because she's not, Ralph, close your ears, okay? She's not an MBA, she's a PhD in engineering. And one of the interesting things that we noted, her background is actually in aerostructures, I believe, which coincidentally happens to be my background. It was also Ed Crawley's background at MIT. So hint to the search committee, pay attention to people who have aerostructures backgrounds because apparently they build things that fly. So with that as a brief introduction, I'm going to ask Vin to take over and bring us through this session.
Well, thank you, Rick. And Rick actually has alluded to, I think, many of the themes that will come up in this conversation. The way we've structured this time together is that I'll first ask the panelists some questions specific to them and their sets of experiences and perspectives that will straddle the past, the current situation, and the future. And then I will ask them a common question of which you're not going to be surprised at the end and see what their various responses are and the comments they may have about each other. But we want to leave enough time after those remarks for you, for our co-participants, to please join us in this conversation. To echo some things that Rick said, it's really a privilege for me to join these special colleagues and friends to what is, I think, an important conversation at this time in Olin. So Ruth, I'd like to start with you, and as Rick just alluded to, one of our favorite publications is the Global State of Engineering Education report sponsored by MIT and that you conducted, and I think finally hit the public press about 18 months ago or so. So it's been about a year and a half of percolation. So what have you seen in the United States and throughout the world, the impact in engineering education of that report in particular?
Well, one of the things I've been very aware of over the last 5 years, perhaps, is that we've entered, I think, a period of quite fundamental and rapid change in higher education and in engineering education. I think perhaps actually less so in the US than in other parts of the world. And that's something that I mentioned in the MIT report. And actually, it's something that I think has accelerated in the 18 months since that report came out. So the report, I think, landed on the desks of a lot of deans of engineering around the world at a very interesting time and at a time of some very interesting conversations. And if I think about the conversations that I've had and the feedback that I've had on the report, I would say that the impact has perhaps been in two different types of institution. One type of institution where they were already thinking about change, they were already planning to make change. And I think the report gave them some real evidence and ammunition and information about making change. So identifying some of the challenges that they may encounter in the change process, highlighting examples of how other institutions have overcome those problems, some leverage for faculty who are perhaps concerned about the risks of making change, but also information for benchmarking. And if you look at, for most institutions that are making fundamental changes to their education, they start with a benchmarking process. And very often that's from a blank sheet of paper. And I think there are a lot of institutions and a lot of parts of the world where they don't have that global connectivity, particularly in the education sphere, that they don't have those people that they can call on and areas of education where they really have that connection. And one critical piece of feedback, and this was one of my real drivers for wanting to do this work, is actually to provide people with that evidence, to give them that connectivity through the report so that they can look and see what best practice looks like, and they can start to make their own connections within that. And then the other type of institution that I think it's had an effect on, based on the feedback that I've had, is the more traditional engineering program, perhaps from a research-led institution who have a profile in research and who perhaps think, well, technically, we're at the top of our game. We get good students, so why on earth should we change? And I think perhaps a level of complacency, perhaps a curriculum that's changed very little in 30, 40 years, perhaps other than the introduction of maybe capstone projects and some team-based projects, but really a very teacher-centered approach, a very engineering science approach. And I think some of these institutions, the report has really started to open conversations perhaps for the first time. Conversations about to what extent are we really providing the best possible education for our students, and perhaps the even more uncomfortable question of to what extent will future prospective students believe that we're providing the best possible education for our students. So I think opening some of those conversations is certainly the feedback that I've been having to the report.
Well, thank you. There were many threads to the observations that you've made there, and hopefully we can come back and pick with some of them. Again, Rick anticipated a topic that I'd like to raise with Al. And as Rick pointed out, Al's really been a leader for more than a decade in industry academic collaborations, especially focused on STEM workforce development. And there have been other organizations, STEM Connector, besides STEM Connector, working in this area. Al, you've worked in these fields for a long time now. With a little bit of retrospection, what do you see as the accomplishments or things that you think have been achieved with these collaborations?
Yeah, thank you, and it's my honor to be part of this panel as well today, so thank you for inviting me. I do think a lot has changed in the last 10 years. I remember joining the first committees I was on and having discussions about if people knew what we meant when we said STEM. because 10 years ago the acronym was not as pervasive as it is. And today I drive around my neighborhood and I see signs for STEM middle school days. I mean, that's a massive transformation. It just didn't exist. But as was mentioned, I started getting deeply involved through co-chairing this STEM Innovation Task Force that was part of STEM Connector. It was a group of like-minded employers, all of whom saw a gap between what we perceived as our need for new young employees and what we were getting. And that costs us time and money as industry. Time and money until we make these people productive. So we studied what are the skills in the gap. We built a model about what those skills were. We started doing roundtables around the United States, bringing in experts, talking about what does it take to grow the digital fluency of students, the innovation skills of students, and also importantly, the professional and employability skills of young people. One thing I realized looking back is when I was younger, it was quite common that we, high school students, had part-time jobs. Very few high school students today have part-time jobs. And through those jobs we learned skills such as punctuality, reliability, trustworthiness, listening to directions, working together. School wasn't imparting these skills. And in fact, these were important skills, important skills for the workplace, important skills that students didn't have. So through our research, we found there was a common thread across these capability platforms, as we call them, and the common thread was experiential learning. And so we started as a group advocating for more experiential learning by doing, as was said in the previous discussion. Really critical, and here at Olin I found an environment where that was happening. So I do think the tide has changed in that regard. I also, though, think that challenges remain. I mean, there's a lot of fragmentation in the efforts. Industry is more involved than ever, but a lot of those efforts are highly fragmented still. We also initially focused on higher education. Most of us in industry, I think, focused on higher education initially, perceiving that as, quote, the issue. But in reality, our problem with the size and diversity of the STEM pipeline starts much, much younger. It starts in K through 12. It starts in the home. And so we've pivoted somewhat to, and industry has broadly been investing more, I think, in the K-12 space. I think that's a good thing. But we still have a long way to go, as was said, to transform education at all levels. Another area that we focus more in the last, say, 3 to 4 or 5 years is community and technical colleges. There are more students going to school there than there are in four-year institutions. They can serve many of the needs of employers if they get the right training. So industry engagement with educators, I think, is another critical theme that I'd say there's a lot more to be done. We need to make education more engaging for young people. We need to connect it to the real world. Programs like the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, these are things that students inherently care about. Sorry if you're teaching calculus, but they don't inherently care about calculus or chemistry, or very few students do. But when you wrap it around a problem, that's a problem that affects their world. And when you talk about the fact that these are the problems your generation needs to solve for our planet, that's highly motivating, I think. So moving education more in that direction is what needs to happen.
Thanks very much. Again, Rick anticipated this. Lynn, of the dozens and dozens of things that you've done, including teach design nature about 2 hours ago at Olin, obviously one area that we all admire and look to was your contribution to making that external engagement part of Olin's mission a reality. I dare say with all my colleagues here in the room that there probably is no Olin faculty leader who has had more experience at Olin and elsewhere with this external engagement work. So again, in a retrospective sense, when you look at the things that you've been involved with and firsthand or observed, what are some of the lessons learned that you can pass to the next generation of people who are going to be beating the innovation and change drum?
Thank you. I think I'm glad you invited me to look back, because I've been thinking a lot about where we came from, not because I think we should be backward looking, but because I think it says a lot about where we're going. And it's 10 years this month since we launched the experiment that we now call the collaboratory, although I think it has a lot of other names and means a lot of things. But that really officially got started in October 2009. And I had an opportunity to read a document that we were using then to frame what it was we thought we were about. And it's really interesting, because I think most of the things we said there are still the critical things today. So one piece of that was that it was very clear that this was not an initiative at Olin. It wasn't even an initiative of Olin. It was ultimately Olin as an initiative. And I think the seeds of that are in what we were trying to do 10 years ago, because we are a college, and we're also a cause. We're also a mission. We're also a catalyst. We're also a laboratory for the world. And what we did 10 years ago was we stopped focusing on making sure that we had the college up and running as our only purpose, but we didn't stop thinking about that. So 10 years ago, we knew that we existed to be a college and a catalyst, and those weren't two different things. Those were the same thing. And I think most of the lessons we've learned since then have been still struggling with that, still wrestling with that, thinking about what that enables us to do that nobody else can do. One of the things I've really learned as I work with other institutions, higher education, but anyone, is you gotta know why you're doing what you're doing. You gotta know what your passion is and what your purpose is. And we've been really fortunate at Olin to be, more so than most institutions, clear on that purpose, which isn't to say we don't have those moments when we sit back and say, wait, do we understand what we're doing? Why? But we really have, compared to almost any other place I've spent time, great clarity. So one of the things that we do when we work with other institutions is we try to identify what they think their purpose is. And I think you've both talked about some of the challenges that other institutions, both higher education and the whole K-12 system, STEM, have about not always being clear why they're doing what they're doing. Sometimes they're doing it because it's the way they've always done it, and maybe they started doing it for a good reason. At Olin, we ask a lot of the time why we're doing what we're doing. We ask maybe more than is healthy. There's those who have tried to help lead us may feel that, but we really do think that's an incredibly important question. And I think it's a question that in both of your domains you've found really powerful, and we've also found it really powerful with others. What is it you're about? What are you trying to accomplish? Forget what you're doing for a moment. Why? And when you step back from that, then you can start to ask questions about how. So a couple of comments about how. One is that we have learned, I think lots of people before us knew and helped us to learn, that learning is not a thing that somebody else can do for you. So there's this analogy about the coach of the soccer team going out and doing a whole bunch of push-ups. It doesn't make the soccer team any better. Right? The coach can help the soccer team to get better, but the coach can't do the push-ups or the soccer drills or shoot the goals. And we, when we're teaching our students, we can do an awful lot to facilitate their learning, but we can't learn for them. And at a meta level, when we're working with other institutions, we believe we have some really important cultural markers that help us to do what we do. And I think you've both been trying to help institutions change their cultures and their assumptions and understand their passion and their purpose. And when we do that, we can't figure it out for them. We, Olin, if we are able to help catalyze change, are able to help catalyze change because we are able to help them figure it out for themselves. And I think that's the last lesson that we've learned, is that we do, I hope, have a great deal to contribute. There are things only we can do, and it will not be because we do it for others, but because we help facilitate their being able to do it for themselves.
Thanks so much. So much, Lynn. I'm glad this session is being recorded, because I'm going to have to look at it and reflect on the wisdom that's being shared. Ruth, I'd like to connect something that Lynn just spoke about and the work that you've done, because besides that very public favorite report of ours, a few years ago you did a report for us where we were trying to assess for ourselves, as you've talked about often when you to do your assessment first, assess for ourselves after we had done a fair bout of external engagement work, what had been our impact in that space. And it was a very informative report. I remember, for instance, one of the insights that I think you brought forward that we all then had to internalize was this idea of inspiring, in addition to working and doing co-creation. So I don't think there are very few people who are not Olin employees who know as much about Olin as you do. Given that, what do you see as the major contributions that Olin can make as we look forward?
Thank you. I think actually the combination of the MIT report and this internal report conducted on behalf of Olin, looking at Olin's external engagement strategy. I mean, a clear conclusion for me is that Olin is in an unrivaled position of leadership in engineering education globally. And that's not just clear to me, I think, from those two reports, but from all of my interactions. A couple of years ago, I did some work with Chile, looking at the massive amount of educational change that's going on there. And the name Olin came up over and over and over again. And that's pretty consistent in a lot of the work that I do. So I think Olin is in an amazing position. I mean, amazing particularly given you've only been in existence for 20 years. But I think there's a huge amount of potential there for the next 20 years to scale up that reach and impact that Olin has. And clearly there's the critical piece of your own education and continuing to innovate and push the boundaries and question and really experiment and continue to be a laboratory. But for me, looking at Olin, the largest potential that I can see is to expand in that external engagement space. And there are so many institutions, as I mentioned before, really looking to make quite fundamental change. And I think looking to Olin for that inspiration and really respecting Olin's voice. And Olin, I think, has an awful lot to give the community in terms of the what. What does world-class education look like? But I think there's even more that Olin could do in the future in terms of the how. And if you look at the MIT report, it identified a number of challenges that were faced by institutions across the world in terms of making educational change and delivering the best possible education. So these are challenges like, how do you scale up? How do you scale up from perhaps an Olin education to a very large and diverse student cohort? How do you make that work in practice? How do you work with faculty to change their mindset and to change their expectations of what it means to be an educator? How do you appropriately reward and recognise faculty for their contributions in education? These are all common challenges faced by institutions across the world. And I think there's a real opportunity for Olin to play a role in helping institutions and working with institutions to combat some of those issues and building strategic partnerships with universities that don't have the same institutional profile as Olin. And I think given the prominence of that Olin has in higher education, and its ambition and its attitude of being a change agent. I think there's a huge opportunity there, for example, to look for global funding for a really bold and ambitious program to support educational change with partners, with other institutions across the world. And I really feel that Olin has a huge potential role to play in supporting a greater change in institutions around the world.
Thank you so much. Again, Al, I think I can connect these topics, and you used a word in one of your responses. I think you were talking about challenges, and you used the word fragmentation and one of the areas that I see, even though there is collaboration, one that is fragmented, is the industry-academic divide, as far as it being fragmented sectors, especially in engineering education, which does have this theory and practice associated with it, and we've seemed to have separated those domains. Again, with the work that you've been involved with, what do you see as the possibility or some ideas about fundamentally changing the industry academic relationships?
Yeah, I do think it has been changing, but I do think also it has further to go. I want to reflect just briefly on Lynn's comments and say that one of my favorite expressions in business, and I think it came from a Harvard Business Review case study, is what you measure is what you get. And measurements drive behavior. And I've worked with many other universities. Traditional ones are maybe the most challenging, public and private, and to talk to deans and professors and department chairs about changing the curriculum, teaching in different ways, is very challenging when the professors as a whole are more concerned about bringing in research dollars, moving their PhD students through the system, teaching their X hours required courses a day. So the system needs to expect something different from the faculty and the staff if we're going to make the systemic changes, I think, that are required. To your question, sorry,
no, that's relevant.
I think it's changing. A couple observations. First of all, I think for the most part, and it was great to get some prompts before this because it really made me think about this a little bit. Reflecting on industry engagement, and I think probably most of you see it as well, is there is generally industry engagement with most universities. It's mostly from larger corporations who maybe have the resources to devote to engaging with industry. And the reality is that there are more employees in small and medium business than in any area of our economy. So I think we need to look for ways to engage more small and medium business with universities, lower the barrier, if you will, whether it's financial, whether it's resources, whether it's reaching outbound to those organizations. So I think that's one big area that we need to think about together. I don't propose to have the answer, but I know the question we need to ask at least. Maybe that's a start. I think that's the most important start.
The hardest thing.
The other one is, and I know it's been done here and at other universities, but I think we need to do it more, and that is bring industry in as instructors, adjuncts and other mechanisms for bringing skilled people in. I've talked a lot to engineering schools about transforming their curriculum to focus more on the engineering process. But the reality in schools is that professors tend to be experts in specific disciplines. So I may teach design and you may teach structures, et cetera. But to understand manufacturability, for example, that's a subject that cuts across all of these areas. To understand sustainability in a holistic way, you need to think through the entire process from ideation all the way through disposal of a product. We don't generally in schools focus on subjects in that way from kind of an end-to-end process point of view. And I realize that too many professors in universities haven't worked in industry don't have that perspective. And so I think that's an area that industry can absolutely help schools move forward, understand how we think about product ideation, design, development, manufacturing, end to end, and bring that point of view more into the educational environment.
Thank you. In fact, anecdotally, we've had some experience at Olin where some of our faculty, during what we call a developmental leave, actually embedding themselves in industrial settings or in application settings that they wanted to become more familiar with. And it was transformational for them, for their career, and for their students. So that's really an important insight. Lynn, another topic that was drifting through these conversations was the shifting paradigms mindset of the students. Now Olin, we have the flags flying of Olin 2020 as we drive up come up the driveway. But from a demographic standpoint, from a societal standpoint, this is a different student population than the student population of 1999. And again, I know you as a faculty leader, as someone who's thought deeply about what that means. What are your insights as the type of things that we've got to think about as we think about curricular and learning for this and coming generations of students?
Well, we've always at Olin been aware that our education, our experience was not a curricular one. It was a whole student, whole life. We are a residential college. And so I think being mindful of all of the aspects of the culture on our campus and how that influences and enables and empowers, or unfortunately sometimes limits or provides obstacles for our students' growth, and frankly, our own growth as faculty, as staff, as members of this community. I think we've tried to be a learning community for all of our members, and sometimes we've succeeded more than others. I think as time continues to change, those needs continue to change. And I said before, I think we're very good at asking, what are we about? And this is a moment when it really feels like the community on this campus is asking, what are we about? Why are we doing what we are doing? What is our intent? What is our purpose? And then, not that we're gonna throw away everything we've been doing, but that we're not gonna start from where we are. We're gonna start from where we aspire to be and use that as a lens to understand where we are. I think we're at a moment in the world where this question is being asked really broadly. You've alluded to some of the ways in which I think the question of why a university, what is a university for? And there are lots of things universities have been for over the ages, foremost among them preservation of knowledge. And I think we could argue, and as a computer scientist I feel compelled to argue, that maybe it's not all about preserving knowledge anymore. We might know how to do that. It's about a lot of other things, like what do we do with the knowledge and which knowledge, and how do we think? And I say that because I think the why of the university is being called into question in this moment more so than it ever has been. And as we start to dissect the many things the university has become, especially the U.S. modern, late 20th century research institution, not that that's the only organization out there, and sometimes we forget that in the U.S., forget the rest of the world, in the U.S., the majority of higher education is not that. So how do we understand what is the purpose of all of these institutions of higher education here and throughout the world? Similarly, what's the purpose of engineering? We've been good at asking that question on this campus. There are lots of partners out there who have also been asking those questions. There's a model of engineering that is, it's the thing that only the guru who sits atop the mountain knows. And I don't think that's the engineering we need today. Not that there isn't depth of expertise, but that we have this model that we go from things that are not technically complex to things that are technically complex, and then hope we can make some of them useful. What about a model of engineering where we start with things that are not very technically complex or useful, think about how to make them useful, and then add technical complexity as needed? Right? What about a model of engineering which is more connected to humanities? What about a model of engineering that's more connected to people? Some of these are things we've been saying for 20 years. Some of these are things other people have been saying for 20 years before that. So what is our purpose? And then we come back to what is the purpose of education? So at Olin, we're an undergraduate engineering education institution. So that question, what is the purpose of education, might have specific answers here. I think we're also a part of this much larger conversation. What is the purpose of education? Is it to create people who find purpose in their own lives? I mean, certainly I hope that's one of the things we contribute to. Is it to help people find jobs? Because as much as we could say, oh, it's all about these higher purposes, it's hard to be focused on those higher purposes if you're not gainfully employed, having things that you feel valued doing and you feel capable of doing. So all of these questions, we need to come back to what is our purpose, and then how do we build a community that helps each of its members to find that purpose, and in which we all help one another to grow.
Thank you, Lynn. And I think you can take many of the points that you've made and frame them as either a problem framework or, to be trite, an opportunity framework. It's the right time to be asking those fundamental questions, and both internally you feel it, but you feel the external forces doing exactly the same thing. So I'd like to bring the questioning together with a common question that I'd love you each to respond to in every way you see appropriate, and perhaps you can comment on each other's responses to this. Again, as Rick alluded to, as a group, but as also as individuals, you have contributed to Olin College's growth and progress over its 20 years, but specifically, I know, in giving advice to its inaugural and current president. So now we are in a situation where a yet-to-be-named individual will have to fill some very large and impressive shoes. And so I can now think of a better group of folks to offer their insights and advice or their guidance to this yet-to-be-named person. So take that however you would like.
Thank you. So I think I would give a number of pieces of advice to the new president. I think the first might be, don't prejudge what Olin is. And I think Olin is a name that a lot of people know and talk about. And I think a lot of people have very fixed and clear attitudes to what they think Olin is and isn't, what it's good at and what it's bad at, and what it needs to improve at. And I think actually when you get to Olin and spend time with the people at Olin, I'm very aware that particularly this piece of work that I did with Olin a few years ago, and I interviewed a lot of faculty and a lot of staff and people from the institution, that it really changed my perspective about what makes Olin tick and what really works underneath the bonnet or the hood, depending on what side of the Atlantic you're on. So I think the first is don't prejudge what Olin is. I think the second is the community is absolutely critical. And I think unlike any other university that I've been involved with before, the community is just so central to who and what Olin is. And between the students, the staff, the faculty, the management, and all of the external players, the level of shared trust and shared passion and collegiality between all of those players, I feel has been absolutely critical to the experiment working together. And I think the new president needs to recognize that and lead from the top to make sure that culture continues. And the final piece of advice would be, don't be afraid to be bold. I had a conversation. I've had a number of conversations actually since Rick announced that he would be stepping down. A number of people have had conversations with me who are interested in applying for the role. And I had a conversation a few weeks ago with somebody whose concern was, Olin is at its peak, and surely as the next president, I can only fail. There's only one way, and that's down. And I think that will be a concern for anyone that comes in. And my advice would be, take advice, understand Olin, really work with the community, but don't be afraid to be bold. Olin needs to move on. If you see Olin as this delicate egg that can't be touched, that actually the college will slowly sink out of into obscurity, that actually you need to be bold and you need to be experimental and not be afraid to move the college to the next place.
Thank you. Lynn, Al, any words of wisdom?
I don't know if it's words of wisdom, but I'll try and make some comments. So first of all, I think that the students here have one of the greatest educational opportunities of any school I've been exposed to in the world, and I don't want to see that lost. So I think the new president needs to your point, keep innovating, keep moving forward. Lynn commented that students are different than they were 20 years ago. I think that's absolutely true. And the teachers / professors will be different in the next 10 years and 20 years, because just like we have students now that are digital natives, so-called digital natives, we're going to have professors that grew up in that time frame in just the next few years as digital natives. And I think they have a different view of what knowledge is, how to use the tools of the digital world, both in terms of learning and in terms of work. So I think that's something that we need to be acutely aware of and understand what type of changes that implies. Not because Lynn's on our panel. I think the externally facing mission of Olin is, I'm hesitating to say the most important, but such an incredibly important mission of the organization here globally. The influence has been mentioned. I mean, Olin gets referenced all over. In fact, I would love to see Olin be advocating not only in the domain of engineering education, but in other disciplines, because I think all of these points we're making don't only apply to engineering. Anyone studying any discipline needs to understand how what they're learning fits in the real world, how they make an impact as an individual with the skills that they're gaining. So I think a lot of the principles from here apply equally across a broad swath of disciplines in education and levels of education as well. I'm working with a New York City public school who I have a friend who is the school social worker there. I've worked with them for 15 years now. It's a middle school and high school. And although there were certain individuals who understood, I believe, what I was advocating for in terms of the importance of STEM education, making education more engaging, I'm really seeing a significant change now where educators are saying, help me find the materials to be able to start doing this. Help me find the references and the examples so I can start bringing this into my school. They weren't saying that 5 and 10 years ago, and I think here you have a base of experience that can help educators really at all levels. And the third thing I would ask is help us explore ways and find ways to blur the line even further between industry and academia. As we said earlier, and especially so that it impacts small and medium businesses, because I think as I thought about this more, I realized there really is a bit of a dark area there where they're much less engaged, my perception, with academia, and yet they have the same needs, or their businesses won't stay at the leading edge, won't stay vital, won't stay economically healthy. So I think that's a challenge for all of us to think about how to make that happen.
Lynn?
There's a real temptation to say, listen to Ruth and Al.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's my first piece of advice is we have some really good partners and friends, Ruth and Al absolutely, but others in this room. There are people here whose advice and whose wisdom have shaped who we are and continue to help us to see around the corners. And so really listening, really understanding what there is out in the world for us to learn from. We started with this year of invention 2000, where we actually went and visited lots of places, and then Sunlin Cho's recent, we miss him terribly, but he enabled us to go back out and start exploring again. And so we do need to keep listening. We need to not lose connection, and we need to listen internally and externally. So that's one big piece. And then I think to understand who we are, why we are, not to see internal and external as in opposition, but to understand that our purpose is the thing that both of those together enable. And that's really critical. It's so easy to think of the internal, the college, the thing we're doing here, and the external, the way we interact with the world. And there are lots of other institutions that potentially could do that. Could be a great institution of higher education and have a great outreach arm. That's not what we have ever been. And that brings me to the last piece, which is I think the next president of Olin will need to understand that we don't exist to do things other people do. We exist to do things only we can do, right? When, in their infinite wisdom, the F.W. Olin Foundation decided to start a college, it was not because the world needed another engineering school. Right? It was because the world needed a different engineering school. And so if we become the best of something that's already out there, we've lost our way. We're here to be different, not for the sake of being different, but because we were given this incredible gift to be able to do things that others could not. And all of the things that you've both talked about that are so important to our mission, to why we are, we need to really be brave. We need to embrace that, and we need a leader who will help us to do that, as we have had leadership to help us do that in the past.
Thank you. And for those of you who may not know, Lynn, among the many things she's doing, is the vice chair of our search committee. So it's important, to really gratifying to hear her perspective. I would hope that there are a lot of questions and comments out there for our panelists. So I'd like to open up the floor.
A bit of a question, a bit of a plea, and it's really kind of supporting your observation, Al, that to me, the great value of Olin is the model. And it is a changing model in that it is a laboratory, and the fact that all the students and the faculty are in fact lab rats, but they're also learning lab rats. And to get people to understand that's one of the most powerful ways to learn is something that is very, very valuable. And if you differentiate, and I look at that from the employment side, because Boston Scientific has been a hirer and a scope project supporter since the beginning. And Olin graduates are better dot collectors than others. And dot connectors are very valuable in life, and it's something that academia in general doesn't do. You're rewarded for building silos and taller and thicker walls, and therefore it's kind of bucking this trend. And I think, I've sort of learned because of the collaboration experiences to date that what makes it very, very difficult is you're bucking the culture and of these institutions. And you may get it within a department, but boy, if the whole school is on the silo route, then they're going to say, well, that's less valuable. I was always struck in MIT where they developed the HST program with bioengineering. The people leading that program were viewed at a lower level than everybody else because they were teaching a hyphenated product. And that, to me, is that unique Olin model. And how you represent it and get it beyond is something that I think has already been great, but it's going to take a lot longer than we thought. So just compliments. And you're right. the next stage is going to be tricky and going to take different programs, but never stop building the plane as you're flying it.
Any comments from the panelists on John's observations?
Only to say thank you for that and many other things, and to underscore, as you've suggested, that perhaps one more piece of advice for the next president is patience, that this is a long game, and we're trying to find ways in which we can make shorter term, more visible changes, and the big play is the long play. So thank you for reminding us of that.
I'm not sure if this is so much of a question as it is a sort of a life's dilemma for me, and I want to share it and ask you to kind of enter into it with me. Myself, and this is not necessarily about Olin, but about the engineering and as an enterprise, its impact on the world that we live in, a technologically infused world. And engineering has a huge impact on what happens and what doesn't happen. And I've been thinking about the fact that most of our science was derived and based on the world as a simple system. And we don't live in that world anymore, that we live in the dynamically complex world. That and those things don't necessarily translate over here. And like Al says, we don't actually, in my mind, have the economies, the goods and services that we need to thrive on the planet together. That there's legacy industries, but we haven't yet conceived of and grown the things that we need. And I'm sort of sitting here with all those dilemmas. Do they look the same to you, or how does it look to you all? Does that sound like a question?
Well, I think that's the power of institutions like Olin, that they're not training students with a certain skill set and with a certain career trajectory in mind, that actually it's creating problem solvers and people who ask questions and explore and know where to identify the evidence and information they need to solve the problem that's in front of them. And I think that needs to be the way that engineering education is going. And to me, that Olin being able to continue to adapt to that and adapt to those kind of challenges that students will face, and knowing that we don't know what their careers are going to look like, I think is one critical piece of why the Olin type of education is the future for engineering education, because it gives students that flexibility, but that ability to build their own skill set and their own knowledge set, and to continue learning beyond graduation, that there isn't an end point there.
Question here.
So I just first wanted to thank you guys for sharing such wonderful insights about kind of the future of Olin and everything. And one thing that I wanted to kind of follow up on was building off of Lynn's questions. So we've heard a lot about today about what is to be gained by the incorporation of industry into education. And one question that I have is what elements of schools kind of is derived from the independence from industry, and in essence, kind of which elements should we be careful to preserve as we incorporate the really important needs of industry into our educational systems?
Yeah, I can try and make a few comments to start. I do think you have certain freedoms here in an educational environment that we don't have in industry, definitely. And in fact, we often in industry look to universities, colleges, et cetera, research institutions specifically for that purpose. We don't have the luxury to often devote time and effort to a completely different way of approaching a problem, for example. So I think that's something unique that schools can bring to the table and should absolutely continue to. Another thing, and in a way it touches back on the comment here as well, I think, is that I'd like to see us think about ways to engage you, the students, more, or the students broadly more, in the outreach that we're talking about, not only to industry, but to other schools. Now, I know Olin students I've spoken to may not have enough time in the day to do that, so maybe that's a challenge for the new leadership, is to figure out how to do that. But one of our big challenges in technical fields broadly, the STEM fields, is the size and diversity, especially of the students who are participating. And I work, as I said, in the South Bronx with this middle school and high school, but unfortunately, I don't look like them. I didn't grow up there. There's a very different exchange that happens when I bring in a young person who came from their community, who literally speaks their language, because most of them natively spoke Spanish. And I've brought in a Spanish woman technical executive, and she flips to their native language, and the engagement is incredible. Or I brought in a group that was hosting the Black College Expo, which was being held in Brooklyn at Medgar Evers, and there's just a whole different dynamic. So how do we harness, I think maybe to your point, how do we harness that as a way to energize the next generation and the one beyond that? So sorry, I veered off a little, but I wanted to make that comment related to this as well. I'll just mention, we're running, I'll call it an experiment. We have a North American rocketry competition sponsored by a not-for-profit in Southern California called the Base 11 Space Challenge. There, we had hoped to get a dozen teams across the United States and Canada. We got 32 teams. There's now 24 remaining for various reasons. Couldn't raise funds, couldn't get the right insurance. One of the requirements they have, in addition to judging their engineering work, is they have to put together a marketing campaign to talk about what they're doing in their communities, in their locale, and they have to have an outreach plan to at least one community college and one high school. So we've got the students, if you will, I hope, doing our bidding. And so it's not me going to those community colleges and high schools, it's 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are going there saying, look at this cool work we're doing, look at this exciting stuff. Time will tell, but we're hoping that we'll be able to energize kind of a layer of student interest that we never did before. So I think, how do we bring maybe the students more into the equation is another thing for us to think about as we think forward.
The other day in Boulder, Colorado, I was sitting in the waiting room of a doctor's office, and a mother came in with a 19-month-old boy, and they sat down, and the little boy reached into his mother's pocketbook and got out her cell phone and started fiddling around with it. And then the mother looked down and said, "How did you do that?" And then the 19-month-old was beginning to teach his mother, how that was done. Anecdote one. In Boulder, Colorado, we have the Boulder Mall, and often when I go down there, I see four teenagers walking side by side, humans, and every single one of them are on this thing, and they're spending, kids are spending 6 to 7 hours a day on this. And third anecdote is that my computer educators are my grandkids, aged 14 to 22. And Harari, who wrote the book Sapiens, also has written a book called Homo Deus. I don't know whether you've read it or not. But in it, he basically projects that we are all, as human beings, with the advent of AI and AGI, becoming algorithms, and that being alive will be being programmed someplace in the future. how are all those, this so rapidly changing world, how are those being incorporated? How can we incorporate those concepts into this idea of education? I project that probably 95% of people in the C-suite have no idea what big data is all about. And probably a lot of people in middle management as well. So when younger generations will be better prepared to change older generations, and this leads to the concept of lifelong learning. But I wonder if any of you would like to respond to how all of those factors are going to impact on what Olin College is going to be able to contribute in the future.
So I'm happy to take that on. I don't know whether you'll find my answer satisfactory. For those of us who were born in the last millennium, we are living in the future, right? The world that I live in today is not the world that I knew as a young adult, let alone as a child, let alone what my parents or my grandparents lived in. And the world in 10 years is likely to be different in more ways than I can predict. The rate is changing. And we also know that even as things change, we are fundamentally the same. It turns out that this is not a relationship, which is not to say that this can't mediate a relationship. And I will tell you that my adult children have relationships that are really deep, intense, and meaningful with people who they've only encountered on the other side of the phone. So don't get me wrong, these can be really important. Sorry, this is meant to be my phone. But we are fundamentally relational beings, and we have, and I say this as someone who studies cognitive science and artificial intelligence, we have always used our most advanced technologies to understand ourselves. So first, we were machines, we were clockwork, we're computers, now we're internet digital beings. We are still the same as we were when we were in caves, with much more sophisticated ways of doing things, including relating to one another. So how do those come together? Well, we're also, Olin, a community of learners. And I learn more from my students than they learn from me. It's just that we learn different things. We learn together, right? And so I don't know how we're going to change how we educate at Olin because of the ways in which our students have changed in all the ways we talked about it, including these. I do know that we here believe that there's some real benefit to looking into each other's eyes and to doing things together. And so we're not quickly going to give that up. And we'd love to learn together with our students all the ways in which we can augment that really important thing that we're currently doing, because it comes back to, why are we doing what we're doing? Well, we're doing it to enable us all to do more, better, more meaningfully.
Thank you, Lynn. Any final questions? Well, with that, I want to thank my three colleagues on this panel. I've certainly learned a lot, and as I said, I'm going to be reviewing the tape. For those of you who don't know, we have a screen here in front of us that's projecting time, not only here, but in London. So Ruth is looking at it saying, it's late. So thank you all for coming in your own ways, such unique contributions to Olin. But of course, Ruth, we're going to give you the Distance Award for doing that. But thank you very much. And